The session today is just about scaling sourcing excellence at speed. We'll talk a little bit about the journey that Maersk has been on. So Adam's going to share a lot of the really good story about the types of projects they're doing, how they've kind of grown their sourcing optimization, sourcing automation story. I'll share some other stories from some of our other clients, projects I've worked on, my history from industry as well. But maybe I'll do just a quick intro and then I'll turn it over to Adam. You can tell us a little bit more about yourself. So I'm Dylan Alperin. I'm our Global VP of Services for Keelvar. Been with the company for about 3.5 years. Before that, spent 15 years in industry. Used to be a director of sourcing. Used to lead global consulting teams that did over $1 billion in sourcing a year. But yeah, kind of worked all over the place. So Adam, tell us a little about yourself.
So Adam Brown, currently at Maersk, been at Maersk for the last 2.5 years. And I know it says here technology platform leader. To translate that, I'm responsible for all of the technology, the automation that's required to support the procurement function and the source-to-pay process. Before that, I was at BT and part of the whole fun with BT Sourced and creation of that company. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Find ourselves here today.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I think one of the big themes obviously is, we want to talk about scale. We want to talk about, if the theme of DPW we've seen a lot this year is like, 10x your procurement, 10x your procurement, we got to figure out how to do more, how to do better, how to do it with less, right? Like that's what I see on all the CPO surveys that they're being challenged to do, and it sounds kind of counterproductive, but I think, we can touch a little bit about some of the ways you guys have found to get there, and maybe just tell us, over the last 10 months, the last year, kind of how your sourcing journey has changed. What are you guys doing now, and how are you trying to scale it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, fascinating path that we've taken over the last couple of years. So, of course, Maersk is logistics, and so if you're into logistics, then you're talking very high volume. A lot of optimizations needed to be done as well, and so we partner with the guys at Keelvar, of course, optimization. It fits in with exactly what we're wanting to do with the big complex landside transportation tenders that we have with multiple lanes and super high complexity. But that's probably sort of fairly familiar ground to most people. What's really interesting is once you get beyond just those big tenders and getting your framework agreements in and getting your rates sorted and getting your rate repositories done, it's then a case of, well, what next? When you're talking about the size and complexity that we have, and just in North America, I was putting some numbers through just to see the complexity that we just have in the North American market, just for moving first mile, just for moving containers from ports, terminals, just to the warehouse. There's 24 quadrillion permutations of what we need to buy. And I know we have some pretty smart procurement people, but none of them quite have the cognitive capacity to do that with Excel.
Yeah.
And so that leads us to the optimization bit. And once you have that number of rates under management, there's always going to be something that's missing. Mm-hmm. And so when you start to find the missing pieces, that's really what starts to take up the time and suck up the time with what we do. And that's where the autonomous bit and the scaling bit really starts to become interesting. You can put that out on the global scale as well. And so if first mile is a very small element of that, and first mile is, again, just containers to from ports over to the warehouses. If that's fairly simple, if you like, containers, there's not that much complexity to them. Start thinking beyond that. Well, what next? What about the middle mile, and what about the last mile? It just absolutely explodes out. Yeah. And so for us to be able to scale that, that's really what's driving the desire to automate as much as we can. And the cost that's involved here is monumental. It's billions and billions and billions every year for us. So that's the why, if you like. Yeah. That's the why we're looking at this.
And I think the last piece you touched on there, I want to give people some context too around, when we talk about scale, what does that volume really look like? Like when I was a director of sourcing, my entire calendar was filled doing 3 RFPs, right? It would take me 4 months to run an RFP for truckload, 4 months to run an RFP for LTL, 4 months to run an RFP for ocean, and I was done. Right, I had 3 people on my team. We were doing this all year round. We didn't have Keelvar at the time. That's why it took so long, probably. But you guys are doing a lot more than 3 RFPs, I think, right?
Yeah, well, I was looking at looking at some sort of facts and figures of just what we've done over the last year. So we started working with you guys earlier on this year, pretty much at the beginning of the year. So looking at the volumes as we've come through, and I think it was in the first 10 months of this year done, I think about 3,000. It's about 300 events or 3,000 events, 30,000 suppliers, and about 20 billion of spend.
Yeah.
And that's tiny. That's a tiny percentage of what we need to do. I would look at that and think that's maybe about 5% of what we need to cover. So the growth that we need to get in and to expand and ramp up, we're not even getting close to where we need to be. And the only way to do that isn't with people, as you say. If you can pretty much manage, 2, 3, 4 things simultaneously, it's probably going to map into 20 big things a year that you're doing. You can see that it doesn't stack up, it doesn't work. Even if you had a procurement function of 1,000 people, and we do have about 1,000 people in procurement, not all of them work on this. But for the 300, 400, 500 people who do work on this, it just simply doesn't scale.
Yeah.
So you've got to get into automation. You've got to figure out, how do we build that into our process? How do we link all of the bits together that people don't need to initiate themselves, so we can then automatically trigger through? But how do we also make it better for the vendors? Because it's one thing for us to automate on our side, but if the vendors can't then be responding back rapidly and quickly and easily and having a great experience, it fails on their side as well. So it's kind of easy to just look at it just from our perspective. But I think it's one thing I've said in the past, when I stole a phrase from, I think it was one of the American generals in procurement, we're sometimes guilty of strategic narcissism. We look at everything from our perspective and forget that we've got these wonderful people called suppliers. Yeah. And we really need that more strategic empathy with them on what's their experience like. If they have a better experience, they're going to give us a better price, they're going to respond faster. I don't. It's sort of fairly well known, fairly public knowledge that the Pactum, who are up here before, we also use Pactum in little points as well to make that supplier experience better. And so it's a very specific use cases that we have. That works very well. And we need to do the same across the piece and do it for the strategic sourcing and do it at greater volume, in greater depth, at greater frequencies in every country in the world, in multiple languages.
Yeah, and I think, what we've seen with you guys so far, you're kind of close to what we see across all of Keelvar right now. About 50% of those RFPs are fully automated for you all as well, right? So when we talk about fully automated RFPs, it's the complete RFP process, from designing your bid sheets, inviting your suppliers, collecting the bids, doing the analysis, doing all the scenario optimization, doing the awarding. So Keelvar's autonomous sourcing is running that entire bid process for you thousands of times a year. You guys got room to improve, because I got some customers that are doing it thousands of times a month, right? And what we've seen with those customers, because you mentioned the supplier experience, which I think is really important here. We're sending this onslaught of RFPs now to the suppliers, so we need to make sure, they can respond appropriately. We set it up to be a good experience for them, and we've seen a lot of success with that still. All right, I've got one customer that has a North America ground expedite bot that they're doing now. They're doing that 1,000 times a month. They're getting 4 to 5 bids on every request. The entire cycle time of that entire RFP is down to 8 minutes now. 17,000% faster than it used to be. It used to take them weeks, literally, to do those requests, and now it is 8 minutes.
That's interesting, because you, effectively with that example, what you're doing is creating a marketplace, which is an absolutely fascinating way to take this. That if you think creating a digital marketplace that people can, the vendors can get in and they can bid to and they can respond to and do that rapidly, it can only drive the optimum price at that point in time.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of great stuff that I've seen people build in there. You can still do traffic light feedback. We have our famous Keelvar traffic lights, all the different feedbacks you can have with the suppliers to kind of drive improvements in their bids. A lot of these bots I see now also have a lot of conditionality around when the bid closes. So this customer, for example, the bid is open originally for 30 minutes, but the suppliers know as soon as they get 4 bids, it's going to automatically close as well. So it drives some kind of competition on their side to make sure, hey, we get in there, we're aggressive, we're in there fast. so that we're going to be able to have a chance to win the business.
There was an interesting experiment I did a few years ago when I was at BT, and I know that there's a couple of my old friends and colleagues from BT in the room as well. We decided to put an intercept on our purchase requests before they got approved and flipped into a purchase order, and just pushed them out for a 24-hour little RFQ, see if we could get things cheaper. And it was fascinating creating that almost a spot marketplace and the theory of competition, even when it wasn't real. And I can see Nick there as well. So yeah, you know exactly this story. It was fascinating. It drove savings in everything. So that theory of competition, everything got cheaper. I think the least we had was about a 2% saving. The biggest one we did was a 23% saving, and that was really amusing because it was the incumbent outbid themselves, and they're the only people in the competition. So being able to do that, that ability to do a spot buy, a spot bid, a spot quote, whatever you want to call it, high frequency turnover, create that digital marketplace, is another contributing factor to being able to scale this up and get through it, because otherwise you're bound by having to do a full-on RFP.
Yeah, that's the key kind of takeaway that I always think about how this needs to be set up, right? To your point earlier, you guys can run the best RFP possible. When I was in industry, we were running the best RFPs in the world, right? But then new lanes would pop up, new requests would pop up that we never even knew about. Our customer moved a warehouse. Okay, we got to ship to a new location that we never did before. So I just spent 4 months running this RFP. Now I have to add new lanes and redo sourcing for part of that. So it's a natural part of the process that's always happening. It's been highlighted more, I think, by the volatility that we see today in every category, that there's always new stuff coming up. There's always new changes. There's always new requirements. And to your point, we can't just continuously add people to manage that complexity, right? We've got to make sure doing the strategic sourcing really well the first time, great. That kind of helps us elevate ourselves out of the tactical a little bit. Then let's add in this layer of automation so that we can automate those best practices that we defined in the sourcing optimization piece of the work. Great, now we've elevated the team further out. That is the really scalable piece, right? When we talk about doing thousands of RFPs a year, thousands of RFPs a month, we're not adding thousands of people to do that. We're adding machines to do that, right? So the team can focus on the much more strategic stuff, supplier relationship management, ESG, de-risking the supply chain. Like, that is the vision that people need to be working on. And
But then taking a little bit further, because of course, you're Keelvar and you have a product. For me, in procurement, it's how do I then link that all together? So how do I trigger it? Because it's one thing talking about scale and talking about how can we do volumes of thousands and thousands, but how do we actually trigger it? You can't have somebody then decisioning and saying, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. So in my land of containers and logistics, I get quite lucky to an extent that for every container on every vessel, I know where it's destined. So we have what's called the on-the-water report, which tells me exactly that. Anything that's on the water, I know a month ahead where it's going to be, where it needs to get to. So it's quite straightforward to run the analytics and understand if there is gaps in our rate repository, if there's something out of date, missing, if there's something that needs to be done. So we can trigger those RFQs. The slightly more tricky version of that is a much more condensed timeline. And it's if one of the carriers just rejects the freight order. For example, they might have a puncture, they might have broken down, they might be on vacation. Who knows? Is to then be able to rapidly do those RFQs as well, rapidly do those negotiations, spot negotiations with vendors, and doing those in any country as well. So for me, the triggers in that cost type are quite simple. They get more complicated and more difficult in other cost types, but the ambition for me for scale is for every cost type that we have, that we've got a strategically negotiated contract in place and a spot buy option, be that friends at Pactum, with you guys, perhaps with something else in other things that we create and build. But I think we need both to account for all scenarios. And then, again, to be sort of slightly procurementy about this, it's then the feedback loop. How much money have I saved? Where do I get it recorded, what that saving was? So we can put it into the weekly report back to the CPO.
I know. I feel like sometimes every CPO survey I look at, cost is always still number one or number two. I think sometimes people like to pretend it's not as important, but we need to be able to do that as well as everything else, right? But maybe on the theme you mentioned earlier, because you mentioned the triggers, right? So one thing that when we talk about scale, that I always think about is like the more volume you have on these types of things, the more friction it creates, right? And integrations can be a really key way to remove that friction. So
Yes.
the triggers can be automated as well, right? Even if we have the greatest bot that can automate the entire RFP and somebody has to go fill out a form, do that 1,000 times, like we don't even want to have that piece, right? We want to be able to trigger it directly in the system. So I'd be interested to hear, I know you guys have a lot of thoughts on the integration side as well.
Get it. Well, this is where I get extraordinarily lucky. When I joined Maersk a couple of years back, it was just two of us. It was me and my chief architect. And since then, we've built our team out and grown it up. We're currently at 90 people in the team. That covers software engineers, data scientists, procurement professionals, everything that you can possibly imagine. So I don't just have the ability to buy and deploy, and we do the change management. I also get to build stuff if it doesn't exist in the marketplace at all. I can just build things completely from scratch. But interestingly, integrate them all together. And some of these things, they come with out-of-the-box integrations. I know you've got a few with, you've got Ariba as the obvious one. You're doing ones with freight waves and some other benchmarking data inputs. But by and large, these integrations don't exist. And our system of record is, and everybody's going to have a version in some way of this, is the tool which is your pipeline in your project management. What are you working on? What stage is it at in your 5 or 6 steps, however many you have? That is a inbuilt tool. That is our orchestration layer. That's our system of record. It's called the Pipeline and Project Management Tool. Not particularly exciting, but...
Didn't come up with a good acronym for it yet?
PPM.
Okay, yeah.
So this really is that. But when you start looking at all of these other things that we want to integrate in, we've built our own middleware layer, which is just there purely for integration. So you can take anything and plug it into anything, regardless of whether you guys have done it or not, which is very lucky for me. Yeah, it is a wonderful place to be, because I don't have to rely upon you or working with somebody else.
I mean, because it's not scalable for us, honestly. If I had to build a custom one-off integration with every single system and every single customer, we would never be able to scale that, right? So like leveraging the open API architecture we have so that anybody can connect anything to it, I've seen that be really successful. All the automations that we have that are super high volume, that are in the thousands, have some type of integration, because that is really a key piece, whether it's just the back end, the front end, both, whether the suppliers come from another system or they come from our system. The key to unlocking that I've seen most often is some level of integration to really add the agility and the velocity.
There is, and when you get to the companies the size of Maersk or the size of BT, where I was, or BP, where Nick is, it isn't simple. It's not a case of we've just got a 5, 6, or 10 tools and systems we need to get into. I've got 2 S4 HANAs, I've got 2 ECCs, I've got Oracle, I've got IFS 10, and that's just the main ERP systems. We're doing acquisitions. We have inbuilt, home-built tools from 15 years ago, and then ones which are much more modern. So the level of complexity is huge between on-prem, between cloud. And just stitching that together, so my colleagues in procurement have a seamless experience, so we can grab automated triggers from flat files, from reports, from systems, and flow it all the way through. As I say, it's the value comes from not just doing the high frequency, but also being able to put it all together so you're not relying on people to trigger something or to record the savings afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. So, I mean, the success I've seen there, I think one thing that I would challenge people on is, you can't just select the best tool, right? So even if you go buy whatever software, Keelvar, everything, and it just sits alone on its own, you can still get a lot of great value out of it, but you can get more when you start thinking about leveraging your internal architecture. Don't be afraid to, we're all afraid of our IT teams probably, but don't be afraid of talking to those teams to work with them on how we can build some of that integrations. Most of the ones I've done are very light, they're very simple. We just need to get very basic information on what are you trying to source? What's the origin? What's the destination? What, IT contractor are you trying to buy? What's the volume? Great. It's very basic information that we need. And we found a lot of success with people doing that.
What I'm interested in as well is just two things. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. If there's any questions, I'd love to take questions.
I have one I want to ask you, so go ahead.
But also, the other thing which I was wondering, we got this far through, we haven't mentioned AI once, and given that Alan from your company is here, we need to mention Keelvar at least, AI once at least. But what was your question?
Oh, I was going to ask you if auctions are cool again, just because you guys run like a much higher percentage of auctions than I see with other customers. I see people talk about it all the time. They got such a bad name for a while. I don't know, are they cool again?
No, love auctions.
Yeah.
It is. There's so many tools that we can use to, figure out what the price is, and that's really what an RFQ or a spot sourcing or any of these much more immediate things does. It's what is the correct price for now. It's just a form of negotiation, if you think about it, but it's what's the price now, what's the correct price that you should be paying. Prediction, if you want to get into that, starts getting into be a very, very interesting use case on how can I start predicting what the prices should be, how can I do that, and we're just getting into the start of that now with, guess what, AI.
Yep.
Anyway, bit of AI, of course, heavily on the machine learning side of it as we get into it and having the feedback loops. But e-auctions, yes, we historically Maersk was before my time famous for e-auctions. We ran thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. Jakob, who left Maersk, I think about 6 months before I joined, he was the absolute king of this, still is. Wrote the book, almost like the definitive book on doing e-auctions. It's a brilliant read if you haven't had it. And you can generate huge success. And I know companies, they mandate that everything has to be e-auctioned. It's another tool, and it's up to us as procurement professionals to decide what's the appropriate tool at the appropriate point to drive and try and derive the best possible price. A lot of that comes down to segmenting your suppliers, how to interact with them, not just segmenting the supply base, but the suppliers and how to interact, which is an interesting one in itself, because we have suppliers in Africa that we have to communicate with on WhatsApp. Don't get that in North America.
Yeah.
So there's so many different ways of doing it, but it is, how can we, to scale, to me, is how do we derive the best way to interact with the supplier, to give them the best experience, to give us the best response in the fastest way possible, and seamlessly automate and integrate that all the way through. So people can focus on the strategic sourcing, the big framework agreements, and the bit where we want the cognitive capacity of our humans put.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, man, if we want to do some questions, we got a couple minutes left.
What tool is Adam using for the auctions? That's the question.
Keelvar. Keelvar, I think you just had English auctions only to begin with.
Yeah, we had Dutch auctions now too.
Good enough. So you've got Dutch now, which coincided with us, signing with you. So
we're here in Holland. We thought it was a good idea to add some Dutch auctions in there too.
So English and Dutch.
Yeah. Don't ask for Japanese though. Nobody's doing it, so don't try and trick me into building Japanese auctions.
All right, got a question from Slido now. So it says, running hundreds, if not thousands of bids per month, how do you manage the complexity of global intermodal freight at scale to obtain a door-to-door price, but still understand the cost components, on carriage, line haul, customs, etc.?
Oh, God, that's going to take probably more time than I've got in 1 minute and 7 seconds to get into. So, first of all, we build our own intelligent, we call it a rate engine. It's a very intelligent rate repository which contains all of the information that we need, all of the rates, who the suppliers are, even down to customer preferred, fully integrated in with our TM system. So we've got SAP TMS, we've got Oracle TM as well, covering both first mile and middle mile. So managing it is super complicated, but is relatively logical how you flow it all through. What becomes really difficult, and the two kind of gotchas, is if you're doing sourcing optimization, how do you link the sourcing optimization through to the what's been optimized by the procurement people, all the way through to then the systems which are releasing the freight orders to make sure the optimizations are both the same on each end. But then the really tricky thing that needs to be done is how do you then ensure that that is then connected into whatever pricing you're giving back out to the customers for an end-to-end pricing to ensure that the profitability is still maintained end-to-end. So it's quite a complicated loop to connect all of those together.
Yeah. I've got another interesting case study, and we're out of time, but the last one I'll tell you is that sales component is an interesting piece because I do have a customer, one of the automations they built that they do like 6,000 to 10,000 a year on is for their sales team. Their sales team in the field is actually launching competitive bids through automation. They get RFPs from their customers. They need to go install giant electrical infrastructures. They have to subcontract out some of the wiring. They actually copy and paste that bid, send it out to their subcontractors. Their subcontractors quote it back to them. They respond into the customers knowing exactly what it's going to cost them. So they're able to respond faster, better information. They're not having to guess on their profitability. They're able to drive a lot of
And that's where the
margin.
gotcha is, because if you're doing a quote that's directly related to a customer that could be then delivered weeks ahead or maybe a couple of months ahead, how do you ensure that whatever price was given based on a cost at the time is covered off, given you've got potentially spot sourcing going on with an 8-minute turnaround consistently in the background? It's pretty complicated, and I haven't solved it yet completely.
One day, I'm sure you will, Adam.
We're getting there.
That's the end of our time for now. Thanks so much.